In the land where I was born, there are now women seeking justice. Justice for birth mothers. Oh Lord, hear my prayer.
Thank you for tuning into Justice for Birth Mothers. My name is 𝐼𝐫𝐞𝐥𝐚𝐧𝐝 𝐏𝐚𝐞𝐝, co-founder and convener to the Alliance of Birth Mothers Campaigning for Justice, Ireland's largest non-TUSLA funded group advocating on behalf of birth mothers in difficulty with TUSLA, the Gardaí and the family court. The mothers that we support are bound by the in-camera rule, which means they could be jailed for speaking outside the family court about what's happening to them. And in today's podcast, I'm joined by the Secretary to the Alliance of Birth Mothers Campaigning for Justice, Dr. Finbar O'Marcaigh. Finbar, thank you so much.
Oh, no problem, Anna. I think it's the least that we can do to bring discussion and a bit of context to subject matters that we're about to discuss, to bring a bit of context to that. So I'm quite happy to have this chat with you.
In today's podcast, we're going to be discussing child sex abuse. And I suppose this is something that really made me feel quite angry recently. There was so much news on social media about Elon Musk entering the discussion on the grooming gangs that had abused children in England a number of decades ago. And he called for Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, to resign over the issue. And all of a sudden, all of the talk in the UK was about Pakistani, foreign, Muslim grooming gangs. And I'd like us to listen now to what Ali Milani has to say. Ali is an Iranian-born UK political commentator and author who, I suppose, was quite alarmed with what's been happening in recent weeks in the UK.
We don't expect much from British politicians these days. Trust is as low as it has ever been, faith in our institutions is beleaguered, and the public seem as distant from our leaders as any time I can remember. And yet, even by the exceptionally low bar that has been set over the years, our politics has hit a new low. For weeks, our country has been engrossed in a national conversation, largely provoked by an offshore foreign billionaire in Elon Musk, about child sexual exploitation and grooming gangs. An issue as serious as they come, but one that has not been immune to the usual partisan politics of Westminster. There are those who seem intent on making the scandal of child sexual exploitation and grooming in Britain a problem exclusively in the Pakistani and Muslim community. Some of the most senior politicians in Westminster, who have never before taken an issue or an interest in this, seem now to be the loudest voices in the room, using every platform, every media appearance, and every minute in the chamber of the Houses of Parliament to call for a national inquiry and decry Pakistani Muslim grooming gangs. But where were they before? Why did the Conservative government, in power for over 14 years, not implement a single of the 20 recommendations of Professor Alexis Jay's 7-year national review into child abuse? Why does a simple Hansard check show that Conservative Party leader Kemi Badenoch and Robert Jenrick did not use the time that they had in Parliament over the years to raise this issue before this month? Why did it take Kemi Badenoch so long to meet with the survivors of grooming gangs and hear firsthand from them the changes that need to be made? We know why. Because this conversation in Westminster has nothing to do with the actual victims or the crimes. This is politics of the most disgusting kind. We have a wave of bad faith actors from across the political spectrum using the very real crimes committed, most often against young women and girls, as a platform to launch their political careers and become the new darlings of the far right. The truth is that the assertion that this is somehow an exclusively Pakistani and/or Muslim problem simply does not hold up to scrutiny. Figures from the police database have shown that where ethnicity is recorded, 85% of group-based child abusers were actually white. The National Police Chiefs' Council have themselves said that it is wrong to say group-based child abuse is predominantly committed by Pakistani Muslim men. So why do so many in our politics and media take this dark and dangerous path? Because they see political strategy. As truth and nuance disappears in our politics and debates are replaced with the wild, wild west of social media, it is now more about defining your enemies and how hard and fast you can attack, divide, and rule.
We've been listening there to Ali Malani, and he's making the point that um, everybody is now rushing to politicise child sex abuse. And I know this is something that you have very strong views on, Finbar.
Yes. Over the last few weeks, as we know, the Rotherham grooming gang is not the right word as far as I'm concerned, because some of the perpetrations, some of the crimes that were committed against young people and children that I've read about and I've listened about have been so horrific. These are violent rape gangs. That's what these people are. Let's be clear about this. There has been a massive online focus on the fact that the particular gangs that are being spoken about at the moment are Pakistani and are Islamic, or mainly Islamic, in terms of the members. And although this is true, I have concerns that by focusing on one specific group in society, the endemic nature of child sexual abuse in the UK and Ireland and other countries is going to be ignored. That child sex abuse exists in every culture, in every small networked culture within wider cultures, such as the Pakistani community in the UK, communities in Ireland, and the Irish Catholic community as well. There's been a long history of it. It's happening in every culture. But what I've seen online, when we know that there have been grooming gangs identified in the UK now for decades, and yet this focus on Pakistani grooming gangs is the first time that I've seen a major furore online about the nature of child sex abuse in the UK. And also I've seen it recently in Ireland as well. And they haven't been speaking about it before. When I look at some of the characters behind the drive for this, they have a history of Islamophobia. They have a history of connections with a state that is promoting at a global level Islamophobia. And I'll be honest about it, I have a concern about that. Now, we have to be realistic here and accept that people from Pakistan and Muslim countries do have very different, we think, views about women. But this misogynistic, highly sexualized view of women as a sex thing is predominant in Western cultures, if you want to put that phrase, Western culture as well. And it's prevalent. It's prevalent within the porn industry that our children have access to, and we are highly sexualized. On the other hand, in Pakistan and other Muslim countries, sex seems to be something that's quite suppressed in many ways. And so there's two very different types of societies in which child sex abuse is endemic. And we have to ask ourselves why. Now, the fact of the matter is that British authorities are claiming that they did not press charges, they did not properly investigate, and in fact, they criminalised the victims and the families of the victims in those particular incidences in the UK. When they did that, to my mind, they themselves committed crimes. They suppressed this information coming out, and they say they did it because they were afraid of stoking racial tension. And I accept that that's why they did it. But when we look at the history of Ireland over the last 60 years in particular, and when we look at the prevalence of the use of sex abuse by the state for other reasons, we can see that maybe blaming a particular group and saying it's about religious sensitivity, that may not be the full story. Within the Alliance of Birth Mothers, we have been contacted by quite a significant number of mothers who've reported child sex abuse by their partners. And this has not been, it's been ignored. In fact, the person reporting it, in many instances, have become not criminalized, but have been intimidated by the state, intimidated by associates of their partner or their husband. And when you look at it closely, you have to ask yourself, why? Why is this? Now, I watched an interview recently with a retired Met police officer who stated openly in the interview that quite often they didn't press charges or go forward with investigations into pedophiles because they were doing them a favour that would be paid back 1,000-fold. Because from then on, that individual that was caught will owe a big favour to the state for not making it public. And they will then own the perpetrator, and the perpetrator will do whatever they want for the rest of their lives. And quite often, the mothers that come to us have partners that are quite powerful people in their own realms. And so it's endemic, although there's no doubt about what happened in Rotherham. And I think it's worthwhile looking into the behaviours of people when they come into our culture from different cultures to see if there is an endemic problem there. I accept that. We do have to do that. But let's not use this as a redirecting method and to take the eyes of the public off the endemic nature of child sex abuse in all of our cultures, in all of our communities, and how child sex abuse, not always, but quite often, has been used by the state, by the police in particular, to direct people to do as they want into the future, whether it's to be an informant, whether it's to lie in court, whatever it might be. That's a serious problem. And although that might sound quite conspiratorial, the evidence is everywhere. From the Kincora boys' home, it's just everywhere. Epstein Island. Our political classes, our business classes, our arts and culture classes, I believe all of them have been compromised. And paedophilia is used as a stick to control people and to direct them to do whatever elements and agents within the state want them to do. And so I'm concerned that this will become a racial or culture issue, and where it's just believed that only Pakistani people or only Muslim people might be involved. Some of them, obviously not all, might be involved in child sex abuse at an even at an organised level. Because we've seen the Irish state ourselves, Anna, do everything to suppress information coming out with regard to young people in Tusla who've been trafficked into the sex industry.
Finbar, if I could just pick up there on a couple of the points that you have made, and you have said that it is not a religious issue, it is a cultural issue, and child sex abuse has been endemic in Ireland. And I just like to read for you from the Triad Rules, which was a 13,000-word report that was submitted by the Alliance of Birth Mothers Campaigning for Justice to every member of the 33rd Dáil. And this is from the chapter on child sex abuse. And it shows that child sex abuse is endemic in Ireland and that there has been close to zero response to it. The Savvy report, published in 2002 when Micheál Martin was Minister for Health and Children, is the largest and only detailed investigation into the prevalence of sexual violence in Ireland. Over 3,000 randomly selected Irish adults took part in the study. Overall, almost 1/3 of women and 1/4 of men reported some level of sexual abuse in childhood. 5.6% of all girls abused in childhood involved penetrative sex. 2.7% of all boys abused in childhood involved penetrative sex. Most sexual abuse in childhood and adolescence occurred in the prepubescent period, with 67% of abused girls and 62% of abused boys having experienced abuse by 12 years of age. In 40% of cases, the experience of sexual abuse was an ongoing rather than a single abuse event. 1/3 of those who experienced sexual abuse as a child now believes that their abuser was also abusing other children at the time. Most perpetrators of child abuse, that's 89%, were men acting alone. 7% of children were abused by one female perpetrator. In 4% of cases, more than one abuser was involved in the same incidents. A quarter of the perpetrators against girls were family members. Half were non-family members known to the abused girl, and a quarter were strangers. Fewer family members were involved in child sexual abuse of boys. 1 in 7 perpetrators was a family member, and 2/3 were non-family but known to the abused boy. Maud de Burgio, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Sale and Sexual Exploitation of Children, presented her report on her visit to Ireland, May 2018, to the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva in March 2019. Her report is a very detailed report where she says she was concerned about the fragmented nature of the government's approach to the issue of sexual violence against children. She said, there is no government-wide effort to prevent and respond to child sex abuse and exploitation. She went on to say that she was also concerned about the absence of regularly gathered comprehensive data on the scope and different forms of sexual abuse and exploitation of children in Ireland. She noted that the conviction rates for child sex abuse in Ireland are extremely low and that there were a number of possible reasons for this. In some cases, huge delays meant that victims were being interviewed long after the incident. The Special Rapporteur mentioned the case of a child who had been interviewed nearly a dozen times and began losing track of her testimony, which led to the court case being dropped. Her report says that interviews were often taken by non-trained personnel and didn't stand up in court. The rapporteur identified, quote, a culture of silence around issues of childhood sexual abuse, unquote, as one of the root causes of the low conviction rate of child sex abuse. She said, this sends a message that consequences are unlikely to follow the abuse of children. Elsewhere, she notes that children belonging to minority communities, children in direct provision, children in the care of the state, children with disabilities were among those who were most at risk of abuse. So you've been listening there to an extract from the Triad Rules, which was submitted by the Alliance of Birth Mothers Campaigning for Justice to every member of the 33rd Dáil. And in fact, the then leader of the opposition, Micheál Martin, sent a PQ to then Children's Minister Catherine Sapona about the report, and she acknowledged having received it, and she addressed a number of the issues that he raised in the PQ. There has been much talk in recent weeks on social media, all of a sudden, about the UCD report on child sex abuse. We're going to listen now to Carl Nolan. Carl Nolan raised the issue in the Dáil on the 30th of November 2023, several months after the report was published.
In June of this year, a scoping report on the sexual exploitation of children in state care by UCD academics Dr. Mary Canning, Dr. Marie Keenan and Miss Ruth Breslin was published. The report outlined in horrifying detail the predatory behaviour that these young people, mainly young girls, are being subjected to. We were told they are being manipulated, coerced or deceived into sexual activity in return for something they want or need, to the advantage, of course, of the perpetrator. We read how some of the most vulnerable children in this state, in state care, are going missing or running away from home or a care placement. despite the fact that some have an intellectual disability, suffered prior sexual abuse or neglect, alcohol or drug misuse. Unfortunately, this frankly terrifying and explosive report was lost in the media noise generated by the RTE payments controversy. It has received nothing like the kind of media and political attention that it deserves, because it is very concerning. I have placed a number of parliamentary questions on this matter. The most recent reply left me almost speechless. I have been informed that almost 5 months on from the publication of this explosive report, the Department of Children has made absolutely no contact with the Department of Justice to discuss these matters, nor has anyone from the Department of Justice reached out to the Department of Children. How can this be, Taoiseach? We know that the Criminal Law Sexual Offences Act 2017 clearly states that a child below the age of sexual consent, 17, cannot consent to sexual activity. This clearly demonstrates that there is a legal and justice-related dimension to this issue. Yet, in 5 months, there has been no engagement with or from the Department of Justice on the scoping report and on its recommendations. I and my staff have met with Dr. Canning and Ms. Breslin, and we had a very informative, fruitful and constructive discussion. They acknowledge that the Minister O'Gorman, took the issue seriously, but clearly there is a desperate and almost unforgivable lack of urgency, which concerns many of us greatly. Urgency must be applied to this issue at the interdepartmental level. I'm asking you today, Taoiseach, to ensure that attention is refocused on this highly significant report and that it becomes a priority of government, and in particular the Department of Children and Department of Justice, to progress the recommendations made within it. Will you commit to doing that here today, Taoiseach?
Thank you, Deputy Nolan. Taoiseach.
First of all, I thank the Deputy for raising this very important issue, and the UCD Sexual Exploitation Research Programme report raises matters of the most profound concern. The Department of Children, Equality, Disability and Integration and TUSLA are aware of risks to children in care, and TUSLA is continually working to address these complex and concerning issues, including working with An Garda Síochána as required. There's no doubt that children in the care of the state are the most vulnerable individuals in our society. TUSLA and the Department are committed to promoting safe and high-quality practice in all areas of alternative care. Now, this report raises concerning issues, as you've said, in relation to the potential exploitation of children, including those in the care of the state. That some of the contributors to the research reportedly felt that young girls in residential care were being targeted by predatory and organised groups. That is particularly concerning. The report does not purport to be representative of the experience, of course, of all children or professionals working with children. Nonetheless, it sheds very important light on these very important matters. Now, Minister O'Gorman, again, as you've fairly said, he has engaged and met with the authors of the report. His officials have engaged with TUSLA to ensure that any child protection concerns outlined in the report have been actively followed up, including in respect of any necessary reports to An Garda Síochána. And prior to the publication of the UCD report, the Department of Children and TUSLA had established a working group looking at institutional and organisational abuse. The Department has since requested that this group examine the report, provide a response and make recommendations as required. I've been informed that once this working group provides a response to the SERP report, it is the intention of the Minister to then pursue what further steps may be deemed necessary. On the 27th of July, the Minister met with a delegation from the UCD SERP, including one of the authors of the report, in order to discuss the research in more detail. He outlined to them the next steps he's taking, and the authors of the report were urged to report to TUSLA any child protection issues that were mentioned in the report and where a child may be at risk. On the 31st of July, the Minister wrote to the Joint Committee on Children in order to provide his observations on the report and outline a number of significant initiatives that TUSLA and the Department of Children have undertaken in recent years to mitigate the risks to children of sexual exploitation while they are in the care of the state. And on Wednesday, the 20th of September, the Minister engaged directly with the joint Oireachtas Children's Committee on wide-ranging matters relating to CHUSLA's provision of alternative care services. And there's a range of key actions that have been undertaken by the Department in respect of child sexual exploitation. On the 10th of July, the Department wrote to TUSLA, requested from the agency a response to the UCD report to outline the extent to which the issues raised are being addressed and identify any gaps relating to child sexual exploitation. The Department again requested that the Institutional Abuse Group consider the report, provide a response and make recommendations. The Department also requested TUSLA to liaise with 𝐈𝐫𝐸 𝐸 regarding the issues raised in the findings of the report, and the Department is leading an interdepartmental group on the national implementation of Barnahus, which is a multi-agency approach to the provision of forensic medical intervention and therapeutic services to children subject to child sexual abuse.
We've been listening there to Deputy Carl Nolan on the 30th of November 2023, raising the issue that there was no communication between Roderick O'Gorman's department and Helen McEntee's department on the very serious issues that were raised in that UCD report. So that more or less confirms what you have been saying, Finbar. When people want to speak about child sex abuse in Ireland, they just don't speak about it or deal with it if it relates to secular white Irish people. But if it relates to the priests in the Catholic Church or nuns, or if it relates to foreigners, then everybody just hops on the bandwagon to talk about it.
Well, I don't think everybody does. The state doesn't, the public broadcaster, the mainstream or the corporate media generally doesn't, because again, just like the Met officers in the UK, when it comes to people from outside Ireland, they'd be afraid to be accused of being racist. So I don't think necessarily that, it's as openly spoken about as possible. The bottom line is it's endemic, and there's a danger by focusing on one grouping within our communities. Like, for instance, I've seen stuff online about, the Quran allows people to have sex, Muslims to have sex with girls from 9 years upwards. Well, the Judaic religious books, the Torah, allows it at 3 years and 1 day. Misogyny, the sexual abuse in one way or another, is in all of the holy books. But religions have moved on from that. I did research, as an example, on child marriages in most Muslim countries in the world. Most Muslim countries have them banned. One of the biggest Muslim countries in the world, Indonesia, a girl can't get married until she's 23. So we have this view that Islam is a monoculture in itself, that it's all the same, but it's not. There's different branches of Islam. There's more modernistic branches of Islam. Within Afghanistan at the moment, which was one time a modern country until the West started to mess around with it again, in Afghanistan and Pakistan, you have more radical Islamic cultures. That's acceptable. In Iran, for instance, child marriage is pretty rare now. It's allowed under very strict circumstances, and it's really only done in very rural and poor areas, and it's done for economic reasons. So we do know that there are Jewish groups who are under investigation at the moment in South America, in North America, for basically having grooming gangs. So there's Catholic, there's Christian groups. If we take, for instance, there was a woman in France recently, she was very brave. Her husband was actually drugging her and allowing, when she was unconscious, allowing strangers, loads of men, to come in and sexually abuse this lady. She found out about it and she went to the police. A lot of men were convicted a few weeks ago. Most of them were white French men, but we didn't call them a Christian sex gang. When we find out about sexual abuse in the Irish Republic, and it's Irish people doing it, we don't call them Catholic predators or Catholic sexual offenders. But when it comes to the Rotherham case, online quite often they've been described as Muslim rape gangs and things like that. And that's very dangerous language. We have as endemic child sex abuse system almost. And I call it a system because the system seems to have developed means and ways of ignoring it. Look at our court cases. How many people every day are up in court across the country for having child sex abuse images, and they walk out of court as though it's only an image, it's only a video, and not considering the fact that there's a child was abused and potentially murdered or is continuing to be abused at the end of that video, where it was made, at the end where it was produced, you know, the other side. And it's ignored. And the courts are letting people out. There's one particular judge in this country that's notorious for it. So to my mind, the system is accommodating it. So there is a system of child sex abuse in this country. And I believe that the majority of perpetrators are Irish in this country. I'm not going to describe them as Catholic sex abusers. They're criminals. That's what they are. They are people who ruin the lives of children. Ruin them, and sometimes in a very brutal way. And so I'm not interested, other than in racially or religiously describing these people collectively, other than to say that there would be a value to looking into the impact and the behaviours of other cultures when they come into our culture, to see how much they align with the law, how much their culture might have a not a predisposition amongst men, but might have very different views of sex. Though I have to say, as I said earlier at the beginning of this podcast, I don't think the views are that different between Pakistan and the United States or the UK or even Ireland in terms of our attitude to women. If you take the legalistic stuff about marriage and that away, and just the sexualized attitude and had the misogynistic attitude towards women, I think that's still very much prevalent in our culture. And it's getting worse with the porn industry and the availability of porn to children and to young people, and the normalization of sex through the availability of porn, which opens up young people to move into circles where they can be abused, which overtly sexualizes them. And so I think it would be a big mistake for us to allow our vision to focus and to laser in on one group alone in society and say that's where the problem lies. When we all know in our heart, it's endemic, it's across the country, it's, you know, you were talking about the failure of the Irish media and the state and state agencies to talk about these things. But they'll talk about fabricated cases, such as the Sergeant McCabe case, in which he was accused of sexually abusing his daughter, all made up. So they're willing to publicise at a very high level fabricated cases for their own benefit, but to suppress the real cases. And I really do believe, not in all cases, but in many cases, people are let off the hook so that they can be used into the future by agents of the state.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. And I suppose what's really coming across is the failure of the state, the Gardaí and the courts to prosecute child sex abuse. And we in the Lions are supporting mothers who went to the Gardaí and they made disclosures about child sex abuse. Long story short, these mothers ended up losing custody of their children, and custody of the children was given to the perpetrators of the abuse. And these paedophiles are protected by the courts, by the Gardaí, and they're also protected by TUSLA. And Deputy Bernard Durkin has been raising this issue. He raised it on close to 40 times in the Dáil since September 2022. And we'll just listen to him speak now. In this extract, it dates back to the 6th of December 2022, and this is what he had to say about what was happening to children.
There is a problem, and it's a matter of urgency. what to do about the children who have been before the courts and their mothers who have been before the courts, or their fathers, as the case may be, where in some cases the Gardaí were ordered by the court to go into the classroom and take the children out and place them in the hands of the person from whom the children were taken previously. To say the least of it, it's a contradiction. I think it's a very dangerous thing. And the unfortunate part is the use of Section 47, which is drawn from Dr. Richard Gardner's proposals in the United States, discredited proposals, and which, to my mind, are disgraceful in the sense that children and their mothers in particular are left crying in the court, and in some cases, and at least one case, more cases, the mother was placed in a cell while the matter was being discussed.
Thank you, Deputy Minister.
Thank you, Deputy. And you know, the case that you talk about there is very difficult situations here. And what we want to see is that the child is put at the centre, and that's important, that the child's needs and the child is considered. And you know, situations where children are, that you've mentioned, where children are taken out of school, is not, that to me doesn't sound to be a good place for any child to be placed in. Can I just say that I have asked my officials to prioritise this action, the action in relation to the family justice strategy, which is supporting children, and which includes as a priority an action to examine the role of expert reports in the family law process and make recommendations regarding their future application and function. So the action will consider the commissioning and the availability of these reports, including their consent and future use. And I asked my officials to prioritise them. And you've raised this with me, and I said it today. And you know, that work will be led in early 2023 by the Department of Justice, working closely with the Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth. It's envisaged that the recommendations arising from the examination will enable the system to clearly hear the voice of children, to ensure that they are supported in their own right, and that their safety, security and best interests are paramount. And they're not allowed to be used as pawns in what can be very difficult
Minister, Deputy Director.
and acrimonious situations.
Thank you, Minister. The sad and tragic fact in these types of situations is not only are the children treated as pawns, but they're also treated in the way that previous generations treated children in concentration camps, whereby their minds are taken to be reformed, to be reoriented in such a way that they will see a disadvantage being an advantage, and vice versa, which leads to a situation, obviously, of confusion, but terrible trauma insofar as the mothers are concerned. And some mothers have been separated forcibly from their children for up to 3 and 4 years in order to prove a point. Obviously, in the case of vindictiveness, these kind of things will happen. But worst of all, the reports, the Section 47 reports, are not being questioned, or no allowance for cross-questioning at all. And that has to stop as a matter of urgency.
You've been listening there to Deputy Bernard Durkin speaking in the Dáil of the 6th of December 2022. Now, up until the election was called before Christmas, Deputy Durkin made close to 40 disclosures in the Dáil about what is happening in the secret family courts. And indeed, at times, there were attempts to shut him down and not allow him to speak. And on one occasion, he said that he had been contacted by more than 100 mothers. So there is a considerable group of children who are now in the custody of the perpetrators of this sexual abuse. And this is going to come out in the future. This, you know, eventually it will be disclosed what the Irish state has done. They have facilitated these pedophiles to abuse these children. and the consequences are absolutely horrific. And if we listen now to two disclosures that were made last May in the Children's Committee, in the Dáil's Children's Committee, when representatives of TUSLA appeared before the committee. In this first audio, we're going to hear Minister Simon Coveney question Ger Brophy. Ger Brophy is TUSLA's lead social worker, and we will discover that it is taking up to 8 years for child sex abuse to come before the courts.
You know, this country has, unfortunately, had a lot of evidence and reports over the last 20 years of sexual abuse across Irish society, which is still there. And, you know, if we're trying to get the response to this right in terms of supporting children, families, increasing the number of prosecutions, encouraging people to come forward, ensuring that, you know, that the guards are linking in with our health and therapy systems in the way that they should, well then, you know, I don't think it's something that, you know, that the first concern shouldn't be budget here, I wouldn't have thought, given the scale of spend across the departments that we're working with here, across 3 different departments that have a combined budget of very considerable amount of money. So I just, you know, my core questions are just the data of the last 4 years. You know, like, I know we are talking about the you know, that it's impressive that we're moving at the pace that we're trying to move to open in Cork, to open in Dublin by the end of the year. But actually, you know, this is a concept that we've been effectively committing to and getting our heads around for the last 5 years now. And given the importance of this issue, I just, you know, I'd like to see the data linked to Galway in terms of the actual measurable improvement that this new model is delivering for children, whether that's on prosecutions or whether it's on the care of children, and, you know, and whether we've what have we learnt, in other words, from the improvement in the model that we're now all looking to back in terms of budget and staff and so on.
Just Deputy Coveney asked about the data as well, just before we go. So it'd be great to see those figures coming through. Senator Siri Kearney referred earlier to the High Court piece and going through the courts and stuff. One of the problems we have at the moment is that it is taking up to 7 or 8 years for cases to get to the court, Central Criminal Court, for prosecution, right? So it's a long lead-in period. So we're looking to cut that down, involve the courts, the guards, the HSE and ourselves. There's significant problems in terms of data sharing that leads to that, the disclosure, the time that takes. So we wouldn't have data after 4 years. If we have data in the next 4 years, we've now begun to gather it. We're beginning to baseline that with An Garda Síochána, working out what are the key metrics that will give us that indication. Because it's not just about prosecutions either, it is about seeing children through it and then how they get their therapy. So we are starting to gather those metrics and have metrics between the 3 agencies. We've never done that before. We've never shared that at such an early stage before. We have a legislative basis to share it, but we've never tried to do it as early. And we probably need changes in the legislation, which again the DC, the IOI are working on, in terms of providing us a clear legislative basis for that with a review of the Childcare Act. So there's a number of challenges coming together to really learn from that. But they're all things we're actively working on. And no more than with this committee, we're getting a huge amount of cooperation and success with it as well.
You have been listening there to Ger Brophy, TUSLA's lead social worker, responding to questions from Minister Simon Coveney. In this next audio from the same appearance before the Dáil's Children Committee in May 2024, Ger Brophy was questioned by Senator Tom Clonan.
Kate, you mentioned in your evidence that you receive a total of 91,924 referrals in 2023, of which 5,467 of these related to sexual abuse. Now, of that number, you say later in your statement that 440 children were dealt with in Barnahoose, I think it's West, over 4 years. Now, this isn't a criticism, this is just an observation, but that strikes me as being like 100 children per annum, and I know that's only in one sector out of a very high number. So what are the criteria, or how do you triage, or who's responsible for triaging the, you know, you have a huge volume of complaints of sexual assault coming in, but a very, very tiny number, a tiny, tiny fraction of that and I must say, I'm actually shocked at the numbers, and please don't infer from my questions that there's any kind of implied criticism. If anything, I would say, you know, for the people who are involved in that on the front line, I know that that can be very, very stressful, you know, because the vicarious trauma of unmet need and the knowledge that there are so many people who, you know, you can't assist or you can't intervene with. How do you triage the large? How do you select, or who's responsible?
Yeah.
Who's the responsible person?
I'll let Jared take you through that process.
Who decides who goes to Barnahoose and who doesn't?
Yeah. So we've worked really hard, and again, this is building on the work in Children First and reporting mechanisms we have for mandatory reporting. So reports are made, whether they're made to the guards, whether they're made to ourselves, we're communicating with each other. If they're made to forensic medical, they're reporting them to us, and we report to the guards as well. Likewise for any other voluntary organisation or anybody else. So those reports are coming in really early. We're able to get them in early to start triaging those where they're, let's say, coming at the same time as they're coming to, so they're coming to Barnahoose, they might come to medical forensics, let's say over the weekend, or to the guards. They'll also be dealt with in Barnahoose, knowing that a mandated report has already been made. So you referred earlier to the very low numbers we have, Senator. And, you know, while we have large numbers of reports that would be classified as sexual abuse, you know, that's often a concern that comes in from the referrer, and they're classifying it as sexual abuse as it comes in. We may, over a period of time, see that actually maybe it's not sexual abuse, or it may be neglect or emotional abuse, or maybe physical abuse. That can be dealt with in 3 years at an early stage. But we do know one of the challenges in every system in Europe, and particularly in Ireland, is very low numbers coming through to criminal prosecution. So even at the end of that, we probably only have 2% coming through to criminal prosecution, and a very low number of those are actually maybe successfully prosecuted. And that's because the perpetrator may be innocent or otherwise. So that's our justice system. But what we're trying to do is identify how we can rise that number, and that was referred to earlier. That's a primary motivating factor behind Barnahoose. How do we give children access to the justice system so that, you know, those crimes can be vindicated and followed through?
Thanks for and thanks.
We've been listening there to Tusla's lead social worker Ger Brophy responding to questions from Senator Tom Clonan, and we now know that the chances of a perpetrator of child sex abuse being prosecuted and convicted is pretty close to zero. So we now have a situation in Ireland where the spotlight is not being put on the fact that we have native white Irish pedophiles being protected by the Gardaí, by Tusla, and by the courts. And this is not being raised in the Dáil as such. It's not been spelt out clearly. And certainly mainstream media is not really picking up on it. So I suppose in order to more or less wind up our discussion for this podcast, what would be the salient points that you would like our listeners to take away from this discussion?
I think the first point is that when we allow our focus to be on one grouping within a community, first of all, it endangers the human rights of so many people. It takes the eye off the ball with regards to the endemic nature throughout our society of child sex abuse. And in doing so, it allows perpetrators to continue to identify and to abuse victims in this country. The bottom line is it's everywhere. And it appears to be something that the state at a minimum doesn't want to deal with, but more likely, to my mind, that agents within the state will use accusations of child sex abuse to their own means and ends. And that's very, very dangerous. We need a massive investigation into child sex abuse in this country. I don't know how we're going to do it because you can't trust the state to do it. But we need to rip away the layers of protection and security that abusers have been given at the moment. You know, we have been contacted by mothers who are afraid to report child sex abuse because they're afraid that their children will be taken off them by 𝐶 for doing so. I came across a case recently enough of a Ukrainian woman in a refugee center who was raped in front of her child. And when she reported the rape to the managers of the Ukrainian refugee center, their reply was, don't say anything to anybody, 𝐶 will take your child from you. And so at every level, now that was said to her for financial reasons, so that their center wouldn't get into any trouble. And ultimately, so that they could continue raking money in. So at so many different levels, there's different reasons why it's protected. But the bottom line, it is protected. And it's everywhere in this country. And focusing in on one group, not only stokes racism or Islamophobia and all those kind of things, but it takes the focus away from where it should be, addressing this as a whole system problem, because that's what it is. It's absolutely everywhere. And particularly in times of the internet, you know the old expression, birds of a feather flock together, where pedophilia and child sex abuse at one time might have been restricted to a particular households, and maybe even was not only endemic in those households, but it was intergenerational. Now, those perpetrators have the potential to link in with other perpetrators in their local area. And so I have no doubt that there are child sex gangs, if you want to put it like that, or networks in every locality in the Irish Republic. And I suspect that most of them, at the moment anyway, are Irish. But I'm not going to call them Catholic sex groups. I'm going to call them filthy, paedophile child abusers, which is what they are.
I have this sense that if we were to round up all of these paedophiles, and if all of them were to be prosecuted, there actually wouldn't be enough jails in the country. The space wouldn't be there to jail them.
I think that problem already exists, Anna. You and I had a discussion about a few weeks ago about what's the solution then, and I suggested that there may be humane forms of chemical castration available that should be at a minimum should be an option for repeat offenders. Possibly it should be mandatory. It's being done in other countries at the moment, but something has to be done because there appears to be no prison places anyway. Not that there's any threat of anybody being sent to prison for it, really, or at least a significant amount of people being sent to prison. So if there's no prison places, if people who are convicted are refusing to participate in programs, and these programs, there's no real evidence that they work anyway. These psychological or these cognitive behavioral programs, there's no evidence that they work. The male sexual drive, I think, the biological sexual drive will overcome any of those programs into the future. So as such, I think there should at a minimum be an option for chemical castration, because these people's lives, the paedophiles' lives, when they're caught, if it's publicised, are ruined anyway. Would they not be better off just not to have their bits working down there and not to have an interest in sex at all and get on with the arts or culture or whatever it might be? There needs to be a solution, because we're not talking about one or two or three people in a community. I believe that in every town, in every regional area, we're talking about hundreds of perpetrators.
I want to thank you sincerely, Finbar, for joining me in this conversation. I think it's just the start of a conversation that the Irish people need to have. It's the start of a conversation that our politicians need to take on board. And I suppose when I said earlier that mainstream media are not picking up on this, I have to add a disclaimer to that. There actually have been a number of very brave journalists who have tried to highlight this issue insofar as they can. And I would like to pay tribute to Debbie McCann from the Mail on Sunday, who has written about this issue and the concept of parental alienation that has been perpetrated in the family courts and used to remove children from loving mothers and hand them over to the men who are sexually abusing them. Thank you for listening to this podcast. We ask you to share it in order to get it out to a much wider audience. Until next time, Beannacht de 𝐈𝐫𝐿.
Thank you, folks.
Justice for Birth Mothers is a co-production between the Alliance of Birth Mothers Campaigning for Justice and 𝐵𝐸 Media. The podcast series received no funding and is made possible by a team of volunteers.
In the land where I was born, there are now women seeking justice. Justice for birth mothers, oh Lord,